Urination, a blown-up car, drugs, sex work, physical violence. Casandra Ventura made some serious allegations against Sean Combs when she testified in his criminal trial over the course of several days. But how did this potentially help the prosecution? Well, I'm going to sort through her testimony, tie it to the specific elements and charges in order to make sense of how all of this was relevant and important in proving the government's case. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Okay, so let me tell you what we're going to do here. There was a lot in Casandra Ventura's direct testimony. Let me say that again. A lot. Urination, violence, sex acts, a blown-up car, Suge Knight. The allegations are horrific. They are disgusting. They are disturbing. When I repeat them at times, I actually kind of get nauseous. Now, this is all from her direct examination, by the way, because at the time of this recording, she hasn't yet faced cross-examination. We will do a separate episode on that. But the question becomes, from a legal point of view, and this is the central question, why is all of this relevant to the case? Okay, so how does it tie into the overall case for the prosecution? More specifically, I am going to explain how this is being used to prove the prosecution's case. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to quickly explain the charges that Combs is facing, okay? So, racketeering conspiracy. This is about how Combs allegedly abused, threatened, coerced women like Ventura to fulfill his sexual desires. That's the allegation. That included allegedly manipulating women into orchestrated sexual performances like freak-offs with sex workers. And to make sure they did this, he would allegedly drug the women, control their careers, leverage financial support, take it away, use violence, threats, intimidation. And also for purposes of this charge, he also would use his businesses, his employees, his resources to create this criminal enterprise that engaged in all sorts of criminal activity. That's another allegation. And that he had team members and he had staff and security who helped to carry out his alleged abuse and his crimes and help cover them up. And actually, for this charge, it's my understanding you would not only need to prove that there was a criminal agreement, a conspiracy, but overt acts were taken in furtherance of this. But you also, my understanding, is you need to prove underlying predicate acts or crimes as part of racketeering. So kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice, that there was this common agreement to do this, there was a common purpose. Again, think of it like the mafia, right? Everything was to benefit the family as a whole, but this mafia organization engaged in, I don't know, kidnapping, drug trafficking, murder, all underlying crimes you need to prove at least two. That's my understanding about how this is going to work in this case. Now, Combs is also charged with sex trafficking of Ventura and another alleged victim. So this is about recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, maintaining, for example, Ventura, to have her engage in commercial sex acts, meaning something of value is exchanged or promised. And that Combs would do this by using force, fraud, and coercion. And I don't want you to forget that. Force, fraud, and coercion. Very important when it comes to Casandra Ventura's testimony. The other charges are transportation to engage in prostitution, relatively straightforward, the allegation being that Combs transported victims like Ventura and sex workers with the intent of engaging in prostitution. So, now that you know the charges, now we have to get into what Casandra Ventura said on the stand. 38 years old, quite pregnant. I think this is one of the reasons why she came up earlier on in the trial to testify and not later on, 8-week trial. But you're talking about somebody who had a 17-year age difference with Combs, 10 years of a relationship, all important factors. What did she have to say? How did it help prove the prosecution's case? Let's talk about it. So to talk about it, I want to bring on Anthony Osso, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, specialized in domestic violence cases. Anthony, thank you so much for taking the time to come here on Sidebar. Before we get into the specifics here, overall, how beneficial was Casandra Ventura to the prosecution's case?
I think it was very, very beneficial, Jesse. But the caveat to that is that we haven't heard the cross-examination yet. And I think the one thing about Ms. Ventura, as opposed to the other witnesses we'll hear from in this trial, is the long-standing relationship she had with Mr. Combs. That's going to give the defense a lot of wiggle room to cross-examine her on their relationship, really. But I think it was beneficial overall.
I think overall she added a ton to the prosecution's case. However, I do believe from a legal point of view, there are multiple avenues for the defense to cross-examine her, and we're going to talk about that. One in particular is what she said at the end of her cross-examination. They may start with that. We'll talk about it. Now, unfortunately, no cameras are allowed in the Combs courtroom. There's no transcribing devices that are allowed. There's no recording devices that are allowed. But if they were, You know how much Claude NoPin would help? This is an incredible tool that leverages AI to boost productivity. So first of all, you can wear it in all different ways. Right here, have it on my lapel. You can also have it on your wrist. You can use it during meetings, interviews, anytime you need to capture everything without lifting a finger. This is what you use. It transcribes in 112 languages, tags speakers automatically, and summarizes everything into one clean template in seconds. And NoPin doesn't just record, it serves as a note taker, allowing you to take notes anywhere, anytime, hands-free. It extracts insights, it boosts your efficiency, it saves time, and also allows you to stay engaged in a conversation. So right now you can get 10% off. Just click the link below or scan the QR code on screen. If you are serious about leveling up, start here. I think from a practical point of view, because she's, 8.5 months, 9 months pregnant, they had to have her testify now. Otherwise, she could give birth and be unavailable. I mean, we don't even know what's going on with victim 3. Having said that, is it a strength or a weakness for the prosecution to begin with her testimony? Because yes, they might start strong. Yes, the case might rise and fall with her testimony, but it's going to be 8 weeks till the jury is handed this case. This testimony is not going to be as fresh in their minds.
I think it's strong, Jesse, and I think it goes back to sort of the advocacy point of primacy and recency, right? Jurors are typically going to remember what they saw at the very beginning of the trial and the very end of the trial. And I think it's important in this case for the prosecution to set a strong tone of what life was like behind the scenes for Mr. Combs. And so who better to do that than the woman who was in a relationship with him for a very long time. Additionally, you don't want the defense to end on a strong cross-examination point, and Cassie Ventura might be susceptible to that. So I do think it was a good play for the prosecution.
It's a good point. Okay, so one of the first things, or one of the main things that she established was, in fact, the freak-offs, or these elaborate sexual performances that were done for Sean Combs' pleasure. First, they have to establish that these things happen. And it wasn't just the testimony of that male performer who testified at the beginning of the trial, it was also Casandra Ventura. And again, these are the center of the racketeering charge, the elaborate sexual episodes. They are center of the sex trafficking charge, that she was trafficked to engage in commercial sex acts. And she testified that these voyeuristic sexual episodes of her having sex with escorts in front of Combs, that this was introduced to her within the first year of their relationship. It was defined by, as she claimed, Astroglide, this lubricant, baby oil. She testified how these happened at multiple hotels and locations. Travel component is important. She testified how she tried to avoid kissing, but Combs told her she had to kiss the escorts, how these would happen weekly. They were so frequent, how she voiced her objections to the freak-offs. In fact, there was an email that was presented in court that Ventura and prosecutor Emily Johnson read back and forth. It was between Combs and Ventura, and she apparently writes Combs how she wants to have sex with him, and he apparently responded, "So who you going to bleep? Want to call someone?" And she responds to the effect that she wants to have sex with him. And he says, "Are you crazy?" And she ends up messaging him, "I want to talk to you about something tomorrow, going to sleep, love you." Combs apparently responds back, "Is it going to stress me out? What is it about?" And Ventura responds, "Freak off, it can wait, it's not a big deal." Combs responds, "Now you don't want to do it anymore." "Oh, I already know. You're so predictable." And actually, in another message to Combs, she apparently wrote to him regarding the freak-offs, "This is all we do." And what she claims she went through was horrific. Allegations that Combs had an escort urinate on her, that she began to choke because of the sheer amount of urine. Another allegation regarding Combs' nipples that I don't even want to get into. Yesterday, she even testified that she had to have freak-offs when she had UTIs or sores in her mouth. Now, Anthony, these are lurid, disgusting descriptions, but these are important for purposes of sex trafficking, right?
Absolutely. I think it goes to show that these are the type of acts that Ms. Ventura is not going to willingly and consensually engage in, right? And I think a lot of what the defense is going to argue is that this was part of a swinger lifestyle and a swinger relationship that she willingly participated in. But these are not normal sex acts that even in the cases I've handled that involve swingers, that swingers would participate in. And additionally, it's let's be honest, it goes to the heart and emotion of the jurors that are going to be deciding guilt innocence in this case. And so it's extremely important for the prosecution to get that point across.
And particularly that these were with sex workers. That's what makes it the sex trafficking component. And I think I have to say, the jury might be confronted with a question: how on earth can anyone have consented to this? But look, the defense will talk about the length of this relationship and whether or not she didn't agree to any of this. And here's what's interesting. So A lot of what she said is almost verbatim to what she described in her initial lawsuit, or the complaint that she filed against Sean Combs back in November of 2023. But the key to this, and what purportedly makes this a crime and goes beyond just kinky sex, is force, fraud, coercion. And she explained that while she first agreed to make Sean Combs happy, her partner, she claims this all escalated and she voiced her objections. And I would say to further force or coercion, because the idea is, why didn't you stop this? She testified how she fought back and she claimed it would make him more violent. But Ventura testified, I mean, he would smash me in my head, knock me over, drag me, kick me, stomp me in the head if I was down. When asked how frequently was Sean physical with you during your relationship, she responded, too frequently. She was asked, were you ever injured as a result of these incidents? She replied, yes. I would get knots in my forehead, busted lips, swollen lips, black eyes. The whites of my eyes would be red, bruises all over my body, just depending. And yesterday she testified that Combs threw her into a bed frame, and the jury apparently even saw a photo of her eye afterwards. She sent it apparently to Combs, telling him so that he would remember what he did. And apparently there was another communication from D-Rock, this is one of Combs' security guards, where he claimed she needed to ice her face because she claims she had been beaten by Combs. So Anthony, the defense has said, yes, there is evidence of domestic violence, but it's not sex trafficking. How do you see this testimony? Do you see it as just domestic violence, or do you see it as sex trafficking?
Well, I think what takes it from domestic violence to sex trafficking, and to answer your question, I see it more so as sex trafficking without having seen the cross-examination. What takes it from domestic violence to sex trafficking is the commercial element to it, the exchange of something for value, which is what the prosecution has to prove to make trafficking and make their racketeering case. And what Combs did to Ventura was he threatened her career, and he also promised to provide benefit to her career. And I think those are something exclusive of the commercial sex workers that pertain only to Ventura that's important for them to make those additional, or not those additional, but the main charges of racketeering and trafficking of persons, is the promise of a benefit.
Can we talk about that? And I want to make it clear, commercial sex acts, right? So for sex trafficking, is it something commercial for the victim or the escorts? What do I mean by that? There was a lot of conversation, a lot of testimony about the escorts being paid, who paid the escorts then being transported. That's also important for transportation to engage in prostitution. But when we talk about, and Casandra Ventura testified, Combs would give her cash, buy her things, pay for her rent. There was testimony about how he was very controlling of her career and how she could earn money, hosting parties, things of that nature. Is that the commercial element, or is it about the sex workers getting paid? Just want to clarify that.
I think it goes both ways, Jesse.
Okay.
I mean, I think it, it can be either. Obviously, Combs is paying the sex workers to engage in sexual acts. What would make that trafficking would be force, compulsion, and threats, things of that nature. But as far as Ms. Ventura goes, I think the trafficking absolutely applies to her. He's offering her something of value in exchange for her sexual acts. And in addition to doing so, he is using threat, compulsion, extortion, and sort of mental abuse in order to get her to do what he wants her to. So I think Ventura is the main person here, but I think it goes both ways.
So that's a great point. So the more control and power you have goes to coercion, right?
Yes.
You're coercing somebody into these sexual episodes. And by the way, particularly because this was apparently happening in all different locations and freak-offs were happening in different cities and places, do you think that ties together as well?
I do. I think, again, like you said earlier, the easy and straightforward charge of transportation of persons for the purpose of prostitution. But also, I think it goes towards the trafficking element, the harboring element. Situations where Ms. Ventura testified she was holed up in a hotel room for 10 days. You've got kidnapping. These are all, again, and not just the trafficking, but the racketeering charge. I think when people think about racketeering, they think of a commercial enterprise. And those are illegal acts that he used his legitimate businesses to carry out. And so it helps him make both the trafficking case, but also that racketeering charge.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting about it. Because also talking Sean Combs' associates, I think her testimony also helped with the racketeering charge, more specifically to prove racketeering conspiracy. And again, you have to show that Combs didn't do this alone, that there was a criminal agreement for further criminal activity, a common enterprise. And Ventura was asked, what would happen if she didn't answer his messages or his phone calls right away. And she replied, he would have his staff, his assistants, his security call her or until they found her. And she discussed security as D-Rock, Bonds, Uncle Paulie, trusted assistants as Christina Coram, David James, that security would take things from her as a form of punishment. She described how an assistant or staff would clean up the scenes from freak-offs. And Anthony, if we're talking about racketeering and that he would use his businesses and his resources and his employees to further criminal activity or further goals of this alleged criminal enterprise, the more people she's naming, that supports the racketeering charge, right?
Absolutely. I think that's a big part of what Cassie Ventura's testimony was about. And I think, obviously we have to read it to the news outlets and everybody's focused on how bad it is, everything that she went through. But a lot of it has to do with that criminal enterprise, the use of legitimate businesses, that makes this really a federal charge as opposed to just a state court sexual assault case.
And with respect to transportation to engage in prostitution and also sex trafficking, I want to just reemphasize this one more time. I think there was some particular testimony I want to call out. So she testified that the freak-offs would happen with Combs and a male escort in New York, Miami, LA, Ibiza, Spain, Turks and Caicos. She explained how escorts were paid to have sex with her. She was shown photographs of alleged sex workers, like one called The Punisher, and how at least one escort was used in multiple cities. So a lot of talk about traveling. Anthony, to me, I was asked this, actually it was on Piers Morgan, and he asked me, do I think he's going to be found guilty? I said, it's difficult to say whether it's racketeering or sex trafficking. There might be avenues to defend here. I am fairly certain that the prosecution has presented enough of a case as of right now for him to be convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, there's a lot more for the case, right? But the defense had said he was paying these people for their time and experience, but the mere transportation of them or her to have sex with sex workers, that in and of itself, isn't that an easy conviction for the prosecution, or am I totally wrong?
So, Jesse, I think the defense will be hard-pressed to convince 12 people that these people that he was paying to go all over the country and even internationally weren't paid sex workers. And while that charge has a maximum sentence, I think it might be 10 years. I could be wrong. It's certainly not a life sentence. The judge can consider relevant conduct like sex trafficking, like racketeering conspiracy, when determining punishment if he was convicted on that kind of loan. So I think it's safe to say that there will be a conviction on this case. To your earlier point, whether it's on all three, I think we need to see more of the trial.
Right, exactly. I agree. Now, I tell you what I thought was interesting was that her testimony mirrored what was alleged in her civil complaint, the lawsuit that she filed against Combs, things that were specifically included there that were never included in the indictments in the criminal case. For example, Kid Cudi, Scott Mescudi, the rapper who Ventura testified she dated back in 2011. I want you to listen to this back and forth. So the prosecutor Johnson says, when you started dating Scott, did you tell Sean about Scott? Ventura responds, no. Emily Johnson, the prosecutor, asks, what was the status of your relationship with Sean at the time? Ventura responds, we were always like up and down at different times. It was definitely a time where we were not in the greatest place. Johnson asks, did there come a time when Sean found out about Scott? Ventura replies, yes. Johnson asks, how did he find out? How did Sean find out? Ventura responds, he actually found out during a freak-off in LA. He went through my phone and I believe he saw emails between me and one of his staff members. Further on in the conversation, Johnson asks, did there come a time after this when Sean mentioned Scott's car? Ventura responds, yes. He mentioned that when we were out of the country that Scott's car would be blown up. He wanted his friends to be there to see it. Johnson asks, when you say he wanted his friends to be there to see it, who is he? Ventura responds, Sean wanted Scott's friends to be there to see the car get blown up in the driveway. Now, we first heard this allegation in Ventura's lawsuit, and apparently his car did in fact blow up in his driveway, and his spokesperson released a statement on his behalf, Kid Cudi's behalf, back in 2023 saying, this is all true. Anthony, isn't this to prove arson, one of the underlying predicate crimes of racketeering?
Anytime you light fire to someone's personal property or habitation, that's the underlying elements to make an arson case. And again, the racketeering conspiracy, using illegal activity through the means of your legitimate business enterprise to effectuate that amounts to racketeering. I think that was an important piece of testimony to make that charge.
And also to help with the idea she was constantly maybe under threat of violence.
Yep.
Like, look what he might be doing. What happens if I don't comply? And I also wonder, am I correct, right, that they have to prove at least 2 underlying crimes for racketeering?
Yes, you've got to prove more than one.
Okay. So, and by the way, talking about that, I think Ventura's testimony also helped to potentially prove other underlying crimes. Drug trafficking, right, as a predicate crime, as she was allegedly supplied drugs by Combs like ecstasy. And just going back to that idea, I think it's also been used to establish the fear element, of sex trafficking. I mean, there was a part of her testimony where she talked about Combs having guns in his safe, that she was handed a gun at one point. She also recounted this alleged episode involving Combs' rival Suge Knight. And this is verbatim from her lawsuit, too, that after a freak-off, D-Rock comes in, says Suge Knight is at Mel's Diner, and he and Combs quickly pack up, drive down there. She was scared. She was crying. Anthony, this is all important for the prosecution's case, right?
Yes, I think in addition to the overarching threat, I think it's protecting Cassie from cross-examination and sort of setting up the prosecution in their redirect examination of Ms. Ventura, that this is not a relationship where she's just compliant and consenting to. There is an overarching threatening behavior that she's in fear for her life, very similarly to what we see in everyday domestic violence relationships.
And force, fraud, coercion. I think the more people that are involved or more alleged criminal activity, it makes the criminal enterprise component of racketeering more believable and digestible for the jury. Power dynamics, though. Power dynamics control big role here. So she claimed that Combs controlled all aspects of her life. There was a portion of her testimony where she talked about how he controlled her appearance, what kind of nails she had to have for freak-offs, complained that she looked too Mexican. And then the financial component is important too. Remember how I mentioned in the racketeering count how to ensure the women like Ventura participated in these sex acts. He would allegedly manipulate them, not only through allegedly drugging them, but controlling their careers, leveraging financial support, taking it away. So paying the rent, paying for the cars, giving her cash, allegedly proving how she made money, like through hosting parties. Again, that power dynamic, Anthony, is central and deliberate by the prosecution here.
Yes, absolutely. This ongoing manipulation. And I think in addition to some of the facts that you pointed out, the filming of these sexual acts and it led to extortion, threatening these women, and especially Ms. Ventura, that if you do this or if you do that or something that I don't agree with, that I will publicly post these videos and ruin your career. And that's extortion. So I think that also helps with the racketeering and trafficking charge.
And the lack of consent overall for sex trafficking, because aside from drugs, which prosecutors said made the victims more compliant, and the theme here is she was afraid of making him angry. And I'm going to go back to these moments. So first, she alleged that Combs had blackmail material on her, that he threatened to release freak-off videos of her to shame her. There's apparently an exchange that was read to the court where she wrote to him, "Please delete any video out of your phone if you have. Too many people have access to your stuff." She testified that he allegedly showed her freak-off videos on a plane, threatened to release them, and she said she felt trapped. And apparently, according to her, when they landed, he wanted a freak-off, and he got a freak-off. So, Anthony, that to me, travel, alleged threat, coerced sex act, that felt like the most direct connection to establish sex trafficking. And Anthony, a lot of the testimony focused on the 2016 incident of him appearing to beat her at the LA Intercontinental Hotel. And she watched portions of footage of this attack, went through it with the jury. Interesting text conversation after she left the hotel, by the way, because Combs apparently writes to her, "Call me, the cops are here, you're going to abandon me all alone, call me please," or call me PLS. Ventura responds, "I have a premiere Monday for the biggest thing I've ever done in my life. I have a black eye and a fat lip. It was time for me to go. You are sick for thinking it's okay to do what you've done. Please stay far away from me." Combs comes back with, "Call me, help, I'm about to be arrested, thanks. If you don't pick up, you'll never hear my voice again. Damn, I would never ignore your calls. Call now, PLS, PLS. Ventura responds, "Plugging my phone in and going to bed. You should do the same." Anthony, why is this all important for the prosecution's case?
Well, I think it's a textbook exhibit of physical force and again, manipulation that leads to trafficking and this coercive behavior. And that's a direct example of manipulation, but I think for the jury to be able to put eyes on it and see, okay, Ms. Ventura is not BSing us. There is direct evidence of physical abuse. I mean, it's good for her credibility, and it's going to make the jury feel negatively towards Mr. Combs before the defense has a chance to open their mouth.
And that's the point, right? Because at the time of this recording, we haven't heard the cross-examination by Combs' defense yet. And the questions of, well, why didn't you leave? You could have left. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. If he had the research to make sure she couldn't leave or manipulated her in such a way. Because, look, the problem is you want to know for the defense, do they have any grounds to suggest none of this is true or this isn't sex trafficking or racketeering? It doesn't meet the elements. Do they have grounds to question whether this was all non-consensual? I mean, she admitted on the stand that she was intimate with Combs one more time after he allegedly raped her, but she said she was with him again by choice. Now, you and I both know this would not be the first time something like this happens, but just let's wrap it up here. As we talked about all the ways her testimony helped the prosecution's case, what are some difficulties you think are going to be for the prosecution with Casandra Ventura when she's cross-examined by Sean Combs' defense counsel?
I think some of the difficulties are going to be the length of the relationship, the amount of time that she stayed with Mr. Combs, her willingness to continue to go do things with him. And she did engage in a consensual, or I wouldn't say consensual, but a relationship that from the outside looking in looked like a good relationship. There was a specific text message on Father's Day where she was telling Mr. Combs that she was excited for him to potentially be the father of her child, right? And I think these are pieces of evidence that the defense is going to highlight in an effort to show that she was willingly participating in the relationship with Mr. Combs and engaging in a swinger lifestyle.
Anthony, I thought this was very useful for people to see because there's a lot to take in, a lot of graphic testimony. It can be overwhelming, but to, condense it in a way that we know why it's relevant to the prosecution's case, I think that's key from a legal point of view. Remember, this is not a salacious article. This is a legal trial. This is a criminal trial. So it's important to understand how it's going to be articulated by the prosecution in their closing arguments when they happen in 8 weeks. But Anthony Osso, thank you so much for taking the time. It was great seeing you.
Pleasure to be on, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
And that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.